Hi, everybody. Thank you. Thank you for having me. And I feel like I've already learned so much in just the last two presentations. I want to talk a little bit about a book I just wrote. It came out on March 1st, and it's called The First, the Few, the Only. And that's really a title and words that I use to describe the experience of women of color who have come up in corporate. The book is on corporate America, but in corporate spaces, and are often the first, in their families to work outside of the home, one of the few in their departments, and usually one of the only at a senior level. I want to maybe just start with why I even got into this. So I spent 20 years in corporate America. As was mentioned, I was a partner at Deloitte. And I was well into my career. I thought I would spend my entire life there. And at year about 17, I started to have growing questions about, a combination of my purpose, given what had happened, I think, in the United States with the last few elections. Just was I doing my life's work? My background had actually been policy and politics. In combination with a growing list of illnesses, I started to get sick, and the symptoms started to mount and mount and mount. And I felt a calling to maybe step away from the work that I was doing, but I found it really difficult. And it took me almost 3 years to leave. And I don't know that I really understood why or how at the time. And in an attempt to figure out what was going on and where would I go, where does one go after 20 years in the bubble of one company, I started meeting with women of color. That was always a passion of mine, to work on diversity and inclusion and to understand topics around it. And so it started as one-on-one dinners. Over time, it turned into about a dozen dinners across the country in the US. And I met over 300 senior women of color, some of the most senior women in corporate spaces. And we would get into these rooms, I thought, for 1 or 2 hours. But we would end up sometimes 6, 7, 8 hours later, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. We were still in the rooms drinking wine, eating chocolate, chatting, because we were finishing each other's stories. There was such shared experience in what was happening to us, and the racism and the microaggressions and the challenges and the extra work that was being asked of us. And what I started to see was patterns. So I decided to step away and to explore that more. And over the last few years, I've interviewed thousands of women of color, but in writing this book, 500 women of color. And the book really tells their stories and their experiences and the patterns that I saw. Working with them or interviewing them, those dinners really helped me leave. I think what I realized for myself is I was struggling with leaving because I was a first, and I felt like all eyes were on me, and that I had given up so much to get there, and that I was not only carrying my own success and my own responsibility, but those of my community and those around me. And I think meeting those women and seeing the patterns and seeing how we were all struggling with those issues freed me to walk away and do this work. And so I want to share just 5 of the big ideas from the book. I just picked 5. There's many more, but these are the 5 that I thought would be great to talk about today. So the first I want to talk about is this moment that we're in. So I think we're in a moment where, again, the slide says corporate America because my research is based on corporate America, but I think this is true now, having met with thousands of people outside of America, but also even outside of corporate spaces. I would now say this is maybe more workplaces. Workplaces are facing a crisis, and I believe women of color are a new power broker. And so data suggests that by 2050, the majority of the growing workforce will be women of color. And it's something to really understand and think about. So we are stepping into a larger majority. At the same time, many companies are facing new and growing conversations around diversity and trying to solve for it, and realizing that they can't. So last fall, we did a big research project, my company, and we interviewed over 1,700 women, both women of color and white women. And the data suggested that 97% of those women interviewed felt like current inclusion processes or current inclusion programs actually don't solve any of the needs that they're looking for. 97% felt like current programs were failing. And so I think we're in this moment where we're a growing number, we're stepping into really larger leadership seats. And at the same time, there is such a need for new voices and new thinking on topics of inclusion, which I believe women of color can bring to bear, given our experiences, given that for a large part, our voices and our stories and our narratives have been muted. And so it's a really interesting time. And so I frame the story this way, or I frame my conversation when I work with women of color this way, because I think for the most part, many of us feel powerless. A lot of the women that I interviewed in those 500, a lot of the women in those dinners would say to me this one line over and over again: I sit in a power seat, and yet I don't feel powerful. And what I want us to realize is that we have a lot of power in this moment, both in numbers and also in content, what we bring to the table in this really important moment where I think everyone's trying to solve for making workplaces more inclusive. The next idea I want to just bring up, and this is really what the entire book is about, it's this idea that, corporate spaces are not a meritocracy. And that for the most part, we haven't really had space to talk about that. Sometimes when I walk into companies and talk about this, everyone kind of steps back and there's a little bit of uncomfortableness in talking about this topic. What I'm trying to really raise is that the workplace shows up for different people in different ways. And although my research, again, is on women of color, what I'm finding is this is true for many groups. And so I often tell a story here where one of the people that I interviewed in my book early on was Renee Myers, and she is the VP of Inclusion at Netflix. And she is a taller Black woman, and it's important as I tell this story, but she's a good friend. And so we sat down to talk, and I thought she would be talking about just workplaces in general and inclusion policy because she is world renowned in the topics of inclusion. But instead, she started talking about airplane design. And she said to me, when her children were younger, she used to really struggle with putting the overhead luggage, above her head. And that the entire flight, she would sit there, almost white knuckling the entire flight, worried that whenever there was turbulence, the luggage was going to fall down and would really injure her children. And I jumped in right away because as a former partner, former consultant, I used to travel 3 cities a week. So sometimes 6 times a week, I was putting my suitcase up and taking my suitcase down. And I'm 5'1" in height. And so that challenge of putting my suitcase up was sometimes a big challenge. I would often go through the experience wondering, why did I pack so much? And why did I wear the wrong shoes? And have this big conversation in my head. And it's also important because I would feel like I didn't belong even before entering that small space. And so here, Renee and I are having this really interesting conversation about, again, a small compartment where we both are having very different experiences about how it shows up for us. And I think that analogy is very true for a lot of workplaces. They show up differently for different groups because many of us weren't in the seats actually defining or designing what they look like when they were first created. I went and did research on this topic of airplane design and found that only 2 to 3% of actual airplane designers were women when that luggage concept was initially envisioned. And so it makes sense to me that it doesn't really work for me from a height perspective. It doesn't work for Renee as a mother. And I think it's a great way to describe why we need to really think about workplace design differently and think about how spaces show up differently for different people. And this idea that the workplace or corporate America is not a meritocracy is not trying to say anything that is, offensive or, trying to break everything apart, but it's trying to get people to really walk in our shoes and understand there are different experiences for different groups. The big idea I walked away with from meeting with these 500 women of color in my own story is that 2 out of 3 women of color I interviewed were sick. And I don't mean sick with a diagnosable illness like cancer. I mean what I call mysterious illnesses. So skin rashes, headaches, heart palpitations, stomach pains, these illnesses that a lot of doctors dismiss. And there's about a dozen that I describe in the book. And almost every single woman of color in the dinners had these. I did 3 speaking engagements this morning. And as soon as I, come to this conversation, all the women of color start messaging me and saying, this is happening to me. Is this a symptom? Is this a symptom? I think there is something really happening for people at work that we need to talk about. And for women of color, I think what's happening is when you are not seen or heard in structures, when you are trying to live up to other people's definition of success, when it doesn't really work and it's not really in your model, you end up contorting and conforming. A lot of why the women of color I interview don't feel powerful is because they are mimicking what has come before them, other definitions of leadership that don't really work for them and don't really look like them because the models that have come before have been white male models of success. And so when you give up parts of yourself, when you try and fit in, when you try and maybe mimic what is not yours, this is what I believe happens. And I spoke with a lot of doctors and they're starting to see this phenomenon even grow amongst women of color, because not only is this always been there, but over the last few years, as we've talked or start to talk about, race at work, and there's more permission to talk about this topic and people are acknowledging it's real. And women are finally starting to feel it in their bodies and acknowledging some of these symptoms. So, the big idea here is that we really need to have a different conversation about workplace trauma. I don't think women of color are just burnt out. I think women of color are traumatized, and it's a different conversation we have to have about what they need to heal and be fully seen and heard in workplaces. The next idea is this idea that the pie doesn't have to be redistributed, it can be grown. And there's two ideas here I want to raise. One is we need to find ways to bring white men into the conversation about inclusion. So often what I hear is that they feel like inclusion is really speaking to other groups. And it is this idea that something is being either taken from them or they're not being included in the conversation. And I think this is one of the biggest hindrances to actually making waves or making change in traditional workplaces. I also think it's a really important concept because it actually affects everybody that I interviewed from all the women I spoke with. One of the second biggest issue past, the women being sick is that a lot of the women at the end of the interviews, I would say, is there anything else you want to share? And they would drop their voices in shame and they would say, can we talk about how women don't help each other at work? And I really wanted to unpack that. And what I started to realize is there is an impression that many of us have that there is one seat for us, one seat for a woman, or especially one seat for a woman of color. And as a result, many of us end up in this conscious or unconscious competition with each other for that seat. And so part of what I believe has to happen is this new conversation around values, around delusions, as I call them in the book, but these things that we've been taught about how the workplace works. So this idea that there is one seat or that there are 12 seats at the table, I don't believe has to be how it is. And so this idea that the pie doesn't have to be redistributed, but it can grow is a really important concept if we're going to have inclusion take root. The final idea I want to touch on is this idea that we have permission to undo anything that's come before. So in my work, I sat down with a Black judge and lobbyist. And as we were talking, she said, Deepa, have you ever heard of the saying, the king has died, long live the king? Have you ever seen that in a movie? And we started to unpack that statement. And what she was saying to me is that people give power to institutions. People give power to things that exist, that we can actually undo anything that has come before because we give voice and power to it. And it's an important concept because as I do work with a lot of women in a lot of companies, a lot of people believe things have to be the way that they are. And part of this work can be hard. But part of what we need to realize is there is opportunity to remake and reimagine. We have to work together to do that, but that is possible. And so I love that statement or that kind of ending because a lot of this work can be negative. A lot of the stories in the book are hard, but I want to leave us with this optimistic idea that we can, remake and undo anything that has come before. It just takes us reimagining and working together. So I want to end with this idea that we need to really work on the power of me. That is a work that we have to do to really define for ourselves what our narratives are, what our stories are, what we believe, how we define success. But as women of color, then we need to find other women of color. So we need to find the power of we. We need to work together to make change. You can't do it by yourself. You can't change corporate cultures or workplace cultures on your own. You're going to have to find others. But as I've been doing my talks, I'm also realizing there is space and need for allies, right? I call them co-conspirators to also come together. And that's the power of us. So if we're going to make work for all, we really need to think about the power of me. Again, what do I believe for myself? The power of we, how we make change together. And then the power of us, of how allies and others in this movement with us can make change so that we can actually make work for all of us.